It was a humid July evening in 1991 when the quiet hum of Milwaukee's Oxford apartments was interrupted by the sound of panic. A man, terrified, handcuffed, and breathless, ran down the street, waving at two police officers. His name was Tracy Edwards. What he told them would lead to one of the most horrifying discoveries in American history. Inside apartment 213, the door stood slightly ajar. The air was thick, a strange metallic smell that lingered in the hallway. The officers stepped in, expecting to find drugs or maybe a domestic disturbance. Instead, they found a nightmare that words could barely describe. On the small table near the couch sat Polaroid photographs, dozens of them, showing human bodies in stages of dismemberment. The images were too real, too detailed to be fake. The officers turned to the quiet man standing behind them, Jeffrey Dahmer, calm, expressionless, his eyes almost empty. When they tried to arrest him, he whispered, "For what I did, I should be dead." As police searched the apartment, the reality of what Dahmer had done began to unfold piece by piece. Inside the refrigerator, a human head. In the freezer, wrapped packages of flesh, labeled and stacked neatly. A 57-gallon blue barrel stood in the corner, filled with acid and decomposing remains. On the bed, tools for dissection. And scattered across the room, bones, skulls, and photographs, trophies of a decade-long killing spree. Outside, sirens wailed as the street filled with stunned neighbors. People who had shared walls with Dahmer stood in disbelief. He had seemed so ordinary, polite, quiet, even friendly. He lent people his phone, offered sandwiches, smiled when passing by. No one could imagine that behind that mild-mannered exterior lived a man who had murdered 17 young men and boys in cold blood. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Reporters crowded the street, cameras flashing as police carried boxes of evidence from the apartment. The city of Milwaukee was in shock. For years, they had lived alongside one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and no one had known. Inside the apartment, investigators tried to make sense of the horror. Every corner revealed another layer of evil: painted skulls, severed limbs, chemicals, and preserved organs. The walls seemed to hold the echoes of unspeakable pain. It was as if the entire apartment had become a shrine to death. When word reached the families of missing men, grief turned into devastation. Many had spent years searching for their sons, never knowing their fate. Now, their worst fears had come true. Their loved ones had been taken by a man who treated human life like a collection. In the days that followed, Jeffrey Dahmer sat silently in a police interrogation room, his calm demeanor unnerving the detectives who questioned him. He didn't deny a thing. Instead, he recounted each murder with chilling precision, when it happened, how he did it, and what he did afterward. There was no rage, no remorse. Only an unsettling honesty. The world wanted answers. Who was Jeffrey Dahmer? How could someone live such a double life, working at a chocolate factory by day and committing acts of unimaginable horror by night? How could a man so normal in appearance conceal such darkness inside him? For the police, it was the beginning of one of the most disturbing investigations in American criminal history. For the victims' families, it was the end of hope. And for the world, it was the beginning of a haunting question: what turns an ordinary man into a monster? The quiet apartment on North 25th Street became a symbol of hidden evil, proof that darkness can live right next door. Behind a smile, behind a locked door, behind a mask of normality. And as investigators carried away the final boxes of evidence, one thought lingered: this was not the story of a madman hiding in the shadows. It was the story of a man who walked among us, unnoticed, until the moment the door to his nightmare world was finally opened. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer had begun, and America would never look at the word monster the same way again. Before the name Jeffrey Dahmer became synonymous with horror, he was just another boy growing up in the quiet suburb of Bath Township, Ohio, a place where lawns were trimmed, neighbors waved from driveways, and life moved at a peaceful, predictable pace. But even in that calm setting, There were signs, faint, almost invisible, of the darkness that was beginning to form inside him. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His father was a hardworking analytical chemist, methodical and reserved. His mother, Joyce, struggled with depression and anxiety, her emotions often unpredictable. Their home life was tense, arguments behind closed doors, long silences at the dinner table, and a young boy caught somewhere between fear and confusion. As a child, Dahmer wasn't violent. He wasn't aggressive or rebellious. In fact, he was painfully shy, quiet, awkward, often staring into space as if lost in thought. Teachers described him as polite but distant. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. But underneath that silence, something was growing, an obsession that no one noticed at the time. It started small, dead animals on the roadside. While most kids would look away, Dahmer would stop, curious. He wanted to know what was inside, how they worked, what they looked like beneath the skin. His father, a man of science, once showed him how to bleach animal bones safely using chemicals. To Lionel, it was a harmless scientific curiosity. To Jeffrey, it was fascination, one that would never fade. Soon, Dahmer began collecting animal carcasses, squirrels, raccoons, even frogs. He would dissect them in a small shed behind the family home, preserving their skeletons like trophies. To him, it wasn't cruelty. It was curiosity, but a curiosity without empathy. He later admitted that he found comfort in the stillness of death, a control he couldn't find anywhere else. By his teenage years, the cracks in his life widened. His mother's mental health deteriorated further, leading to constant fights with Lionel. The home became a battlefield of words and emotions. And Jeffrey, unable to cope, retreated further into himself. In high school, he was known as a class clown, not because he was funny, but because he sought attention in strange ways. He mimicked people with disabilities, staged fake seizures in hallways, and performed bizarre pranks. His classmates called it doing a Dahmer. Beneath the humor, though, was deep loneliness. At around 14, Dahmer began drinking heavily. He hid liquor in his locker, sipped beer during classes, and arrived at school already intoxicated. When teachers confronted him, he smiled politely and brushed it off. Alcohol became his escape, his way to silence the thoughts that never left him. Then came the feelings he didn't understand, his attraction to other boys. In 1970s Ohio, such desires were taboo, and for a boy as isolated as Dahmer, they brought shame and confusion. He began fantasizing not about love or companionship, but about possession, about control, about keeping someone close, forever. By 18, his family was falling apart. Lionel moved out temporarily. Joyce, emotionally unstable, soon took Jeffrey's younger brother and left. Alone in the family home, Jeffrey Dahmer was completely isolated, a quiet teenager with no supervision, no purpose, and a mind spiraling into obsession. That summer, in June 1978, Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old heading to a concert. The two shared a few beers at Dahmer's house, laughing and talking. When Hicks eventually said he had to leave, something inside Dahmer snapped. The thought of being alone again was unbearable. He struck Hicks from behind with a dumbbell. When the young man fell, Dahmer strangled him to death. Hours later, he dissected the body, methodically, calmly, and buried the remains in his backyard. He was only 18 years old. That murder would mark the beginning of a nightmare, one that would remain hidden for nearly a decade. Afterward, Dahmer continued life as if nothing had happened. He went to college briefly, joined the army, and even tried to start anew. But the urge, that dark compulsion, never left him. It was dormant, waiting for the right moment to return. In Bath Township, no one suspected a thing. To his neighbors, Dahmer was the quiet boy who kept to himself. But behind that silence was a secret, one that would one day horrify the world. The boy from Bath Township had taken his first life. And though the world didn't know it yet, Jeffrey Dahmer had crossed a line he would never come back from. After the murder of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer's world didn't collapse. It went eerily quiet. The summer air in Bath Township was still, the trees whispered. The roads stretched empty. And beneath that deceptive calm, a teenager lived with a secret buried in the soil behind his home. But Dahmer didn't panic. He didn't confess. He didn't run. He simply went back to life as if nothing had happened, drinking, drifting, trying to pretend the horror he created didn't exist. Yet deep down, he knew something had changed forever. Once he crossed that line, there was no going back. After his parents' divorce, Jeffrey's life began to unravel. He enrolled briefly at Ohio State University, but his drinking spiraled out of control. He skipped classes, failed exams, and spent most nights drinking alone in his dorm room. Within months, he dropped out. His father, furious but desperate, decided to send him somewhere that might fix him. In 1979, Dahmer enlisted in the U.S. Army. It was supposed to be a fresh start, discipline, structure, purpose. At first, he did well. The military gave him a routine, a mask to wear, and a new environment where no one knew his past. But discipline couldn't silence his demons for long. Stationed first in Texas and later in Baumholder, West Germany, Dahmer worked as a medic. But his drinking worsened, and with alcohol came his darkest urges. Fellow soldiers would later recall that Dahmer was quiet but unsettling, the kind of man who stared too long, laughed too little, and drank until he lost control. Two men later accused Dahmer of drugging and sexually assaulting them while stationed overseas. Both described the same pattern. He'd offer drinks, turn strangely calm, then become violent and predatory. Though there was never an official conviction, the accounts revealed something chilling. Dahmer's need for domination was resurfacing. By 1981, his drinking had become intolerable. The army discharged him honorably, not for violence, not for misconduct, but simply for unsuitability. To avoid embarrassment, they bought him a plane ticket and sent him home. But home was no longer home. His parents had moved on, his brother was gone, and Bath Township held only memories of what he buried. Dahmer drifted, first to Florida, then back to Ohio, and finally to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. She was a kind, devout woman who hoped to guide her troubled grandson back to faith. To her, Jeffrey was polite, quiet, even helpful. He mowed her lawn, went to church, and kept his room tidy. To everyone else, he seemed like a man trying to rebuild his life. But inside that small house, something was stirring again. The silence of the basement comforted him. The loneliness, once unbearable, became his world. He took a job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, a night shift that suited him perfectly. While the city slept, Dahmer worked alone, surrounded by the hum of machines. He'd finish his shift, drink until dawn, and stare blankly at his reflection. Each day blended into the next, until his urges returned. In 1982, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure, 2 years later for disorderly conduct. The crimes were small, but the pattern was clear. He was testing boundaries again. Then, in 1986, he was arrested for masturbating in front of 2 boys. He told police it was a misunderstanding, and the court let him off with probation. His grandmother prayed harder. His father visited often. Everyone hoped he would change. But the truth was, Jeffrey Dahmer was slipping back into the abyss. He began visiting gay bars and bathhouses across Milwaukee, searching not for companionship, but for control. When the management banned him for misconduct, he turned to something worse, luring men to his grandmother's house. That was where it all began again. In 1987, Dahmer met Stephen Tuomi, a young man at a Milwaukee bar. They drank together, laughed, and checked into a hotel. Dahmer claimed he had no intention of killing him. But when he woke up the next morning, Tuomi was dead, his body battered, his chest crushed. Dahmer later said he couldn't remember doing it. But once again, he didn't stop. He bought a large suitcase, packed Tuomi's body into it, and took it to his grandmother's basement. Over the next few days, he methodically dismembered it, just as he had done years earlier in Bath Township. This time, there was no shock, no panic. Only silence. He kept Pomi's skull as a reminder, a token, and with that act, Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into madness truly began. In the quiet town of West Allis, neighbors saw a polite, soft-spoken young man living with his elderly grandmother. But behind the closed door of that basement, behind the smell of chemicals, behind the muffled hum of a freezer, the boy from Bath Township had become something else entirely. Something the world had never seen before. By 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer was living with his grandmother in a quiet Milwaukee suburb. To the neighbors, he seemed like an ordinary young man, polite, soft-spoken, even helpful. He mowed lawns, took out the trash, and went to church with his grandmother on Sundays. But beneath that calm exterior, something deeply sinister was festering. In the basement of that modest home on South 57th Street, Dahmer had begun turning his darkest fantasies into reality. The room smelled faintly of chemicals and rot. Old newspapers lined the floor. On a small wooden table sat bottles of bleach, jars, and an assortment of sharp tools. To an untrained eye, it looked like the messy workshop of a curious young man. But to Dahmer, it was something else entirely, a private laboratory of death. His descent into monstrosity was gradual, almost methodical. Dahmer was obsessed with the idea of control, of keeping people close to him permanently. He had been abandoned, rejected, and left alone too many times in his life. In his mind, killing wasn't about hate or rage. It was about possession. He didn't want his victims to leave him, not ever again. It began innocently enough, or so he told himself. He would bring men home, promising drinks, conversation, or photographs. Once inside, he slipped sleeping pills into their drinks. When they fell unconscious, he would sit beside them, sometimes for hours, staring at their faces as if trying to capture that fleeting moment of companionship before it disappeared. Then, when the inevitable emptiness returned, he would act. In that basement, Dahmer carried out his experiments in silence. He dismembered his victims with a disturbing precision. Bones were cleaned and bleached. Flesh was dissolved in acid. What couldn't be destroyed was hidden, in bags, boxes, or beneath the floorboards. The house began to smell, and his grandmother complained. But Dahmer always had an excuse. Spoiled meat, dead animals, chemistry experiments, and somehow she believed him. Each killing made him more confident, more detached. He began collecting trophies, skulls, bones, preserved organs, small reminders of the control he once had over another human being. For Dahmer, they weren't just remains. They were symbols of intimacy, proof that someone had once been his, even in death. In his twisted logic, he believed he was building something, not just a collection, but a monument to his loneliness. I wanted to keep them with me, he would later confess. A part of them, at least. The horror deepened when Dahmer began to realize that death wasn't enough. He wanted his victims alive, but obedient, incapable of leaving. He began experimenting with crude medical procedures, drilling holes into skulls and pouring acid into the brain, trying to create what he called living zombies. It was a chilling reflection of his desire to have total control without facing abandonment. One night, a victim awoke mid-procedure, confused, terrified, still half-drugged. In a panic, Dahmer strangled him, then sat in silence for hours beside the body. The reality of what he'd done seemed to hit him in waves, yet instead of stopping, it only pushed him deeper into madness. He began collecting body parts more obsessively, the smell of decay mixing with the scent of chemicals, the air thick with the stench of death. By this time, the basement had become a graveyard that no one knew existed. The walls held his secrets. The floor hid his crimes. Family dinners upstairs went on as usual, his grandmother praying over the food, unaware that beneath her feet lay the remains of young men whose lives had been brutally cut short. But Dahmer was changing. His addiction to killing was becoming uncontrollable. He began drinking more heavily, skipping work and losing touch with reality. His grandmother grew uneasy. The late-night noises, the constant smell, it all became too much. Eventually, she asked him to move out, not realizing she was sending him from one house of horror to another. When Dahmer left that home in 1988, he carried his demons with him, and the experience he had gained in that basement would define everything he did next. The tools, the chemicals, the techniques, all of it would evolve into something far worse. The basement of bones had been his training ground, a place where the man inside him had fully transformed into the monster the world would soon meet. He had perfected the art of death. And now, in his own twisted mind, Jeffrey Dahmer believed he was ready to begin his real work. The quiet basement in West Allis would soon be replaced by a small apartment in Milwaukee, apartment 213, a place that would become synonymous with pure unimaginable evil. When Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 in Milwaukee in 1990, it looked like a simple one-bedroom apartment, cramped, lonely, but cheap. For most people, it was a temporary shelter. For Dahmer, it became something else entirely, a private laboratory of death, obsession, and unimaginable horror. Neighbors would later recall that he was quiet, polite, and oddly solitary. He smiled when he passed them in the hall, carried his groceries without a word, and occasionally offered them a beer. There was nothing threatening about him. He looked like any other man trying to make ends meet. But inside his apartment, Jeffrey Dahmer was constructing a world that defied reason, a place where humanity itself was dismantled piece by piece. The transformation began slowly. Dahmer furnished his apartment with dark curtains that shut out the daylight. He bought a new refrigerator, a metal drum, a fish tank filled with exotic fish, and bottles of hydrochloric acid. The place smelled faintly of chemicals and spoiled meat, a stench that would later become infamous among his neighbors. When they complained, Dahmer would smile calmly and say, "It's just my fish, they keep dying," but the truth was far worse. Behind those closed doors, he was experimenting, not just with murder, but with control. His victims were often young men, usually lured by promises of money or companionship. Once inside, Dahmer's demeanor would change. He would offer them a drink, often laced with sleeping pills. When they lost consciousness, his horrific rituals began. Dahmer photographed each stage meticulously, the posing of bodies, the dismemberment, even the bones. For him, these were not just trophies, they were pieces of an illusion. He wanted to build a shrine of memory, a physical monument to the control he could never achieve in life. The refrigerator stored severed heads. The freezer held human hearts and organs. The metal drum, filled with acid, was used to dissolve flesh. Yet somehow, amid this nightmare, Dahmer maintained a chilling sense of normalcy. He went to work at the chocolate factory, chatted casually with coworkers, and even attended family gatherings. His calmness was terrifying, a mask so convincing that even those closest to him couldn't see what lurked beneath. Inside the apartment, though, he was spiraling deeper into darkness. He began keeping skulls and bones as decoration, carefully cleaning and painting them. He arranged them in symmetrical patterns, on tables, shelves, even inside drawers. He once told police, after his arrest, that he dreamed of sitting in the center of a room surrounded by the bones of his victims, feeling completely at peace. The smell became unbearable for his neighbors. One woman, Pamela Bass, remembered it vividly. She said the odor seeped into the hallways, sour and chemical, like rotten meat mixed with bleach. But every time someone asked, Dahmer had an excuse. "The freezer broke," he'd say. Or, "I had some old meat that went bad." His soft voice, his politeness, it made people believe him. Still, the apartment was becoming his entire world. He decorated it with skull posters, black tablecloths, and blue lights that cast eerie shadows on the walls. He played the same movie, The Exorcist 3, over and over, claiming it gave him power. Sometimes he would sit for hours drinking beer, staring at the heads in his freezer, whispering to them like companions. He told police later, "I didn't want them to leave me. That was the core of Dahmer's madness. He wasn't just killing for pleasure. He was killing to stop people from leaving, trying to freeze time, to preserve human connection in the most horrific way imaginable. His crimes continued unchecked for nearly 2 years inside that small apartment. Police were called multiple times, once when a boy, bleeding and drugged, escaped into the street. But Dahmer convinced the officers it was simply a lover's quarrel. They returned the boy, 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone, right back to him. Within an hour, Konorak was dead. By 1991, apartment 213 had become a tomb disguised as a home. 17 victims in total, all young men with dreams, families, and lives vanished behind that door. And yet no one truly saw it. Not the neighbors, not the police, not the city. When the truth finally came out, that small apartment would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in history, a physical representation of what happens when evil hides behind ordinary walls. In the end, Dahmer's apartment wasn't just a place of death. It was the perfect mirror of his soul, ordinary on the outside, horrifying within. It was a world where empathy had rotted away, replaced by obsession, loneliness, and a desperate need for control. The apartment of nightmares wasn't just a crime scene, it was a reminder that sometimes the darkest monsters don't live in the shadows. They live right next door. For years, Jeffrey Dahmer's name has dominated every headline: the Milwaukee cannibal, the monster next door, the butcher of men. But behind that darkness were 17 human lives, boys and young men with dreams, laughter, families, and futures. Lives that have too often been reduced to numbers in a list. To understand the true horror of Dahmer's crimes, we have to turn away from him and listen instead to the victims' stories. They came from different backgrounds: African American, Asian, Latino, Native American, many from marginalized communities, many struggling with acceptance in a world that didn't always see them. And that's exactly what made them vulnerable to someone like Dahmer, a man who offered a drink, a photograph, or simply understanding. Each name deserves to be remembered. Stephen Hicks, 18, was the first. It was the summer of 1978, and Stephen was hitchhiking to a concert near Bath, Ohio. Dahmer, just freshly out of high school, offered him a ride. They drank beer together at Dahmer's house until Stephen said he wanted to leave. That simple decision, that ordinary moment, turned fatal. Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell and dismembered him, the beginning of a darkness that would last 13 years. Next came Stephen Twomey in 1987, a gentle 25-year-old from Milwaukee. Stephen worked at a restaurant and loved art. Dahmer claimed he woke up one morning in a hotel room to find Twomey dead beside him, insisting he had no memory of killing him. He placed the body in a suitcase and took it back to his grandmother's basement. This was the start of Dahmer's pattern: murder followed by dismemberment, then photography. Then there was James Dockstader, 14, a Native American boy who had dreams of becoming a model. Dahmer met him near a Milwaukee mall, offering him money for photographs. He never came home. His family searched for months. Police dismissed it as a runaway case. Richard Guerrero, 22, loved music and spent most of his time helping his family. He vanished after telling his sister he was going to meet a friend. He never returned. Anthony Sears, 24, an aspiring model and artist. Dahmer called him the most beautiful man I ever met. He kept parts of his body as trophies, even moving them when he changed apartments. Eddie Smith, Ricky Beeks, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, each of them vanished quietly, one by one. Most of their families never received updates, no investigations, no closure. For many of them, racism and homophobia played a cruel role. Real missing reports from gay Black or Latino men weren't treated with urgency. Then came Konorak Synthesomphone, just 14 years old, the boy who might have stopped Dahmer if the system had listened. 2 women called the police, desperate to protect him. But when Dahmer calmly told officers it was just a lover's quarrel, they handed the boy back to his killer. Less than an hour later, Konarak was dead, and his body was found among the others in that infamous apartment. Tony Hughes, a 31-year-old deaf man, couldn't hear or speak, but he communicated through sign language and smiles. He dreamed of becoming a model. Dahmer met him at a gay bar and lured him home. Friends searched for him endlessly, never knowing they were dancing in the same bars that Dahmer haunted every weekend. Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Breithoft, all young men, all taken between June and July 1991. By then, Dahmer's killings had become almost mechanical, his need to control, to possess, to never be alone again. But behind every photograph Dahmer took, behind every body part found, there was a person who laughed, who dreamed, who loved. In court, their families finally had a voice. One by one they faced Dahmer, their grief raw, their rage unfiltered. "I hate you, Jeffrey Dahmer!" screamed Rita Isbell, sister of Errol Lindsay. "I don't ever want to see your face again." Her voice shook the courtroom, and the world watching on TV. For years, the victims had been invisible, young men dismissed by society, lost in the margins. But that day, they were seen. Their faces filled the screens, their names echoed through the halls of justice. Errol Lindsay, 19, loved to fix cars. Curtis Strotter, 18, wanted to go to college. Dean Vaughn, 28, loved to dance. They were more than just victims. They were sons, brothers, and friends. And yet, even today, their names are often overshadowed by the man who destroyed them. To truly understand this story, we can't keep repeating Jeffrey Dahmer's name like a spell. We must remember them, the boys who trusted, the men who vanished, the families who never stopped searching. Their legacy is not in the horror of their deaths, but in the reminder they leave behind, that society must see those it chooses to ignore, that every life, no matter how quiet, how different, or how small, matters. And maybe, if their cries had been heard sooner, if someone had cared enough to look deeper, the nightmare of Milwaukee might never have happened at all. It was the night of July 22, 1991, humid, still, and deceptively quiet in Milwaukee. The city had no idea that one of its darkest secrets was about to be exposed by a man who would become the lone survivor of a living nightmare. That man was Tracy Edwards, 32 years old. Confident but cautious, a man who deepened through life as rough edges, but could read danger when it stared him in the face. Earlier that evening, he had met a soft-spoken, blonde-haired man named Jeffrey Dahmer at a local bar. Dahmer seemed polite, calm, even gentle. He offered Tracy money to come back to his apartment to take some photos. Nothing about his tone suggested the monster that lurked beneath that calm surface. When they arrived at apartment 213 on North 25th Street, something immediately felt wrong. The air was thick with a strange, chemical stench, something between rotting meat and cleaning fluid. There were boxes stacked oddly in corners, a blue barrel in the bedroom, and a faint hum from the refrigerator that seemed louder than usual. Dahmer brushed it all off with an awkward smile. "Just cleaning up after the fish tank," he said. But Tracy noticed something else, the dead eyes. Behind Dahmer's faint smile was a cold, hollow stare, as if his body was present, but his soul wasn't. They sat down. Dahmer handed him a drink, laced with sleeping pills. Edwards took a sip, but not enough to feel dizzy. Music played softly in the background, a strange mix of calm melodies that only made the silence heavier. Then Dahmer changed. His expression hardened. His voice dropped low. He pulled out a knife and pressed it to Tracy's chest. "Do as I say," he whispered, "or I'll kill you." Panic rose inside Tracy, but he didn't fight. He stayed calm, thinking fast. He could tell Dahmer was unpredictable, maybe high or in a trance. Instead of running, he tried to talk to him, tried to keep him distracted. "You don't have to hurt me," he said. "We're friends, right?" For the next few hours, Edwards played a dangerous psychological game, a performance to survive. Dahmer handcuffed one of his wrists and tried to lock the other, but Edwards resisted. As the night went on, Dahmer made him sit beside him on the couch. Watching The Exorcist 3, he seemed entranced, mumbling about power, control, and keeping someone forever. At moments, Dahmer would zone out completely, breathing heavily, staring at the TV as if he was lost in another world. Edwards saw this as his only chance. He watched the pattern, studied the rhythm of Dahmer's madness. He waited for the perfect moment. When Dahmer leaned forward, distracted by the movie, Tracy bolted. He punched Dahmer in the face, broke free from his grip, and ran sprinting down the hallway, barefoot, shirt torn, one hand still cuffed. He didn't stop until he found 2 police officers on patrol. Out of breath, he told them, "He tried to kill me. He's a freak. The cuffs are his. Go to his place, you'll see." At first, the officers were skeptical. They had heard strange stories before, and Dahmer looked too calm to be dangerous. But Edwards insisted, pointing to the apartment building. Finally, the officers agreed to check. When they knocked on apartment 213, Dahmer opened the door, trying to smile through the tension. The police entered, and what they found would shock the world. On the bed was a stack of Polaroid photographs, dozens of them. Each one showed men at various stages of dismemberment. Bodies posed, heads preserved, torsos without limbs. Officer Rolf Mueller froze. "These are real," he whispered. In that moment, Dahmer panicked. He tried to fight, but it was over. The officers overpowered him, handcuffed him, and called for backup. The calm, polite man they had met minutes ago had transformed into a trembling monster. As more officers entered, they uncovered skulls in the refrigerator, a heart in the freezer, acid-filled barrels in the corner, and tools of unimaginable horror. The apartment had become a tomb of death, a place where human life had been dissected and stored like trophies. Outside, as police cars filled the street, Tracy Edwards sat on the curb, shaking but alive. His single act of courage had ended a decade-long killing spree that claimed at least 17 innocent men and boys. For the first time, the world saw the true face of Jeffrey Dahmer, not the quiet neighbor or the soft-spoken man at the bar, but the predator who lived among them, feeding his darkness in silence. Tracy Edwards' escape was more than just survival. It was the moment evil lost its disguise. The monster who had hidden behind politeness and charm had finally been exposed, not by the police, not by an investigation, but by one man's instinct to live. And from that night onward, apartment 213 would no longer be a quiet corner of Milwaukee. It would become a symbol of unimaginable horror, and of one survivor's will to bring it all to light. When the world finally learned the name Jeffrey Dahmer, it wasn't just another criminal case. It was an earthquake that shook America's conscience. What began as a missing persons report turned into one of the most horrifying investigations in modern history. The kind of story that made even hardened detectives lose sleep. It all started on July 22, 1991, in Milwaukee. Police officers Rolf Mueller and Robert Roth were responding to a call from a terrified man named Tracy Edwards. Edwards claimed he'd been held captive by another man, handcuffed, threatened, and nearly killed. The suspect's name, Jeffrey Dahmer. At first, the officers thought it might just be a domestic dispute. But as they followed Edwards back to the Oxford apartments, to apartment 213, everything changed. When Dahmer opened the door, he was calm. Too calm. The apartment looked ordinary at first glance, tidy, dimly lit, with a faint chemical smell in the air. But Edwards whispered, "He tried to kill me." That was enough for the officers to investigate further. Inside the bedroom, Officer Mueller spotted a drawer, slightly open, just enough to catch a glimpse of Polaroid photographs. He pulled them out, and what he saw froze his blood. The photos weren't of scenery, or friends, or art. They were of dismembered bodies, in various stages of mutilation. Real, detailed, meticulous. When Mueller turned to Dahmer and whispered, "These are real," Dahmer simply said, "Yes." Then, with a sudden twist, he tried to resist arrest, but it was too late. The officers overpowered him. What came next would horrify the entire world. As police began searching the apartment, they uncovered a nightmare so unimaginable it didn't seem humanly possible. Inside the refrigerator, a human head wrapped in plastic. In the freezer, 2 human hearts, carefully preserved. In the kitchen, skulls, painted and bleached. In the bedroom closet, bones arranged neatly. And in a 57-gallon blue drum of acid stood 3 torsos dissolving, their remains floating in the chemical mix. Detectives and forensic teams arrived, stunned by what they were seeing. It was as if they had entered a chamber of horrors, an apartment turned into a laboratory of death. Every inch of that place told the same story. A man who killed not out of rage, but out of control, obsession, and emptiness. Over the next several days, the investigation deepened. Every piece of evidence, every photograph, every bone had to be identified. The sheer scale of Dahmer's crimes overwhelmed the system. Detectives had to match body parts to missing persons reports, to reconstruct lives that had been erased. And as they pieced it together, they realized something even more disturbing. This wasn't new. For over 13 years, Dahmer had been killing across multiple states, Wisconsin and Ohio, and yet, he had slipped through the cracks of the system again and again. Investigators found that Dahmer had prior arrests for indecent exposure, child molestation, and sexual assault. But time and again, he was released early, given lenient sentences, or ignored. The most tragic example was Konorak, Synthesum phone, the 14-year-old boy the police had literally handed back to Dahmer 2 months before the arrest. Now, those same officers who had ignored the warnings faced a storm of public outrage. As evidence mounted, the Milwaukee Police Department came under heavy fire. How had they missed this? How had so many disappearances been dismissed as runaways? The investigation wasn't just about Dahmer anymore, it was about the system that allowed him to exist. Psychologists and criminologists from across the country were brought in to study the case. Dahmer's confession tapes revealed the full extent of his crimes. He spoke calmly, even politely, about dismemberment and cannibalism. "I had these desires," he said. "They didn't go away. I tried to control them, but they controlled me." To investigators, it was the ultimate contradiction. A man so ordinary on the outside, yet capable of such monstrous acts within. Dahmer cooperated fully, almost disturbingly so. He gave precise details, names, methods, dates. For weeks, detectives listened as he mapped out a decade of horror. He showed no pleasure in recalling the crimes, but also no remorse. It became clear that this wasn't just a case of murder, it was a study of the human abyss. Dahmer wasn't a madman screaming in the dark. He was a calculated, detached predator who hid behind kindness and charm. For the victims' families, the investigation was unbearable. Every new discovery was another wound reopened. They had to listen to how their sons were killed, how their remains were kept, photographed, used. Some fainted in court, some screamed at Dahmer when he was brought in. But beneath the sensationalism, the investigation revealed something more profound, a mirror held up to society's blind spots. The ignored victims, mostly men of color. The prejudice that silenced families. The indifference that let evil grow unchecked. By the time investigators finished cataloging every piece of evidence, over 80 separate human remains had been found, parts belonging to at least 17 men. Detective Patrick Kennedy, who spent weeks interrogating Dahmer, said later, "He was polite. He called me sir. He'd eat sandwiches while describing how he cut up bodies. It was the most disturbing calm I'd ever seen." The investigation finally ended months later, but it left behind a haunting truth. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they live quietly in plain sight while the world refuses to see. And in apartment 213, the walls still seem to whisper the same story, that evil can thrive not because of darkness, but because of neglect. When Jeffrey Dahmer was finally arrested on July 22, 1991, the world struggled to comprehend what the Milwaukee police had uncovered. Inside apartment 213, they found severed heads in the refrigerator, jars filled with preserved organs, skulls painted and bleached, and photographs of dismembered bodies, a crime scene so grotesque it seemed unreal. Even the seasoned detectives who entered that small one-bedroom apartment were left trembling. One of them would later say, "It was like stepping into hell." But as the investigation unfolded, something even more disturbing emerged. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't fit the image of a monster. He wasn't wild, loud, or insane-looking. He was calm, polite, even soft-spoken, a man who spoke about his killings with a chilling sense of reason. That's what made the coming trial so haunting. It forced the world to face the reality that evil can wear the most ordinary face. When the trial began in January 1992, America was transfixed. Courtrooms were packed. News cameras lined the streets. Protesters held signs demanding the death penalty. Survivors' families filled the front rows, faces edged with grief, fury, and disbelief. Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of murder, each carrying a possible life sentence. The evidence was overwhelming. His confession alone stretched for more than 160 pages, describing every murder in shocking detail, when, how, and why he did it. But the real question at the center of the trial wasn't if he did it. That was undeniable. The question was Jeffrey Dahmer sane when he committed these crimes? His defense team argued that Dahmer was insane, that his acts were driven by uncontrollable impulses, by a twisted form of sexual obsession that blurred his grasp on reality. They described him as a man trapped between desire and compulsion, saying he didn't want to kill but couldn't stop himself. The prosecution, led by Michael McCann, countered sharply. Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing. He lured, planned, and concealed. He bought chemicals, acid, saws, and barrels, all to destroy evidence. He tricked the police multiple times. That wasn't insanity. That was calculated evil. To prove their point, they played the tapes of Dahmer's confession. The courtroom fell silent as his calm voice described the unthinkable, how he would drug his victims, strangle them, dissect them, and keep their remains. He spoke as if he were recounting a grocery list, no emotion, no remorse, just method. One juror later said, "It was like listening to a man describe how to fix a car, not end a life." Then came the families. They took the stand one by one, their voices trembling, faces streaked with tears. "I wake up every day thinking about my brother," one said. Another mother stared at Dahmer and whispered, "Why? Why my son?" Through it all, Dahmer sat motionless, expressionless, occasionally nodding or lowering his eyes. When he finally spoke, he shocked the courtroom again. In a short, monotone statement, Dahmer said, "I did what I did, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. I know I deserve whatever punishment I get." It was chilling, a confession not of rage, but of possession. He wasn't driven by anger. He was driven by loneliness. He wanted to control, to preserve, to never be abandoned again, a perverse form of love that had turned to horror. On February 15, 1992, after 2 weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in prison. There was no death penalty in Wisconsin, but for many, this was a fate worse than death. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Crowds outside cheered when they heard the sentence. The families wept, some with relief, others with the hollow grief of knowing nothing could bring their loved ones back. As Dahmer was led away, handcuffed, he turned slightly toward the gallery and said quietly, "I know my time is limited. I just want to find peace." But peace was the last thing he would ever find. Even behind bars, he remained an object of horror, both feared and fascinated. Other inmates avoided him. Guards whispered his name like a curse. Journalists and psychologists flooded him with interview requests, all desperate to understand one question. Why did he do it? Was it childhood trauma? Neglect? Mental illness? Or something darker, something no psychology could ever explain. The trial didn't give the world closure. If anything, it deepened the mystery. How could someone so quiet, so normal, commit crimes so monstrous? Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer just a man. He had become a mirror forcing society to confront an unsettling truth, that evil doesn't always come with a warning that monsters can live next door, smiling politely as they wave goodbye. And for the families who lost everything, that truth was the most horrifying part of all. When Jeffrey Dahmer was found lifeless on the cold concrete floor of the Columbia Correctional Institution in 1994, it felt like the final page of a gruesome story. The man who had haunted America's nightmares for years, the Milwaukee cannibal, was dead. But what no one realized then was that Dahmer's death would not bring closure. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one that forced America to confront not just the horrors of one man, but the failures of a whole system. Because Dahmer's story wasn't only about murder. It was about everything that allowed it to happen: the ignored victims, the missed warnings, and a society that looked away until it was too late. After Dahmer's arrest in 1991, the world tried to comprehend what he had done. 17 young men, many of them Black, Asian, and Latino, lured into his apartment with charm, promises, and manipulation. Inside, they faced unimaginable cruelty. It wasn't just murder. It was methodical destruction, a slow erasure of lives and identities. But when the news broke, one question echoed louder than the rest. How could this have happened for over a decade without anyone noticing? The answer was painful. Dahmer's victims came from marginalized communities, people often ignored, judged, or mistrusted by the very systems meant to protect them. Police dismissed missing persons reports. Neighbors' complaints were brushed off. Even when officers literally returned a bleeding boy, 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone, to Dahmer's doorstep, believing it was a lover's quarrel, they unknowingly handed a child back to his killer. Hours later, the boy was dead. That one decision, that one failure, became a symbol of how deeply race, prejudice, and apathy allowed evil to thrive in plain sight. After Dahmer's capture, the city of Milwaukee became a portrait of grief and anger. Families gathered outside courthouses holding pictures of sons and brothers who would never come home. The media swarmed, dissecting Dahmer's life as if searching for a logic behind the madness. Was it childhood trauma, mental illness? Was he born evil or made by circumstance? But for the victims' families, those questions didn't matter. They wanted accountability, not explanations. During the 1992 trial, Dahmer listened as the families of his victims faced him directly. Their words cut through the courtroom like knives, raw, trembling, filled with rage and sorrow. One mother screamed, "You took my son's life. You don't know what pain is." Another asked, "Why him? Why my baby?" Dahmer, surprisingly calm, often apologized, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as someone acknowledging the irreversible weight of his sins. "I did what I did," he said. "Not because of hate, but because I was sick." Those words divided America. Some saw him as a cold manipulator, others as a deeply broken man trying to understand his own darkness. But for most, it didn't matter. Nothing could justify what he had done. When Dahmer was killed in prison 2 years later by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, some called it karma, justice finally catching up, but others saw it as an escape. The man who should have spent a lifetime facing his crimes was granted a quick, almost merciful end. Yet even in death, Dahmer's presence lingered. His apartment complex -924 North 25th Street was demolished to erase the memory of the horrors within. But the soil, neighbors said, still felt cursed. No one wanted to live where so much pain has soaked into the ground. And then came something even stranger, the fascination. Books, movies, documentaries, even art exhibitions, all trying to unravel the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer. Over time, that fascination turned uncomfortable. In online forums and fan letters, some began to romanticize him, calling him misunderstood, even handsome. It was a disturbing, Reminder of how easily society can blur the line between curiosity and obsession. For the families, this new wave of attention was like reopening a wound. Every Netflix show, every headline, every meme, it brought back the faces of the sons they lost. But if there is one thing Dahmer's legacy truly gave the world, is awareness. His crimes sparked conversations about mental health, police accountability, systemic racism, and the protection of vulnerable communities. Training in law enforcement changed. Missing persons protocols were re-examined. Society began to see that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they smile, wave, and offer you a drink. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not one of mystery, but of warning. It's a mirror reflecting how evil can thrive in silence when fear, ignorance, and indifference allow it to grow. Today, decades later, the name Jeffrey Dahmer still sends chills down the spine. Not because of the gruesome details of his crimes, but because he reminds us of what can happen when humanity forgets to see one another as human. Evil didn't die with Dahmer. It hides in neglect, in prejudice, in the quiet corners of our world where people are unseen and unheard. His legacy, as dark as it is, forces us to look closer, to listen harder, and to promise, never again. Because remembering the victims, not the killer, is the only way to make sure that the next Jeffrey Dahmer never finds a place to hide.